How important is the CEO when it comes to a stock's success?
In today's Ticker Take, we're looking at how leadership can influence business and your investment returns.
And that's why we're speaking to Roy Gori, one of the most successful CEOs of the past decade. So hit that subscribe button and let's get started. This is Ticker Take.
Well, John, a lot of investors talk about investing in good management teams. So today we're going to help define that.
Well, and Roy talks a lot about the importance of culture. So we'll get into that. But also, what is the drive of a CEO and everything it takes to become a chief executive? And in Roy's case, an early start in life, getting a part-time job at 8 in his native Australia, or going straight into the world of finance out of high school at the age of 17, or working nights to get his degree and then his MBA.
All right, let's hear now from Roy Gori.
Roy, thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we like to start our podcasts off with a little game, if you're game.
Okay.
So we're going to give you 3 things, and you'll just tell us if you're bullish or bearish.
Okay.
Okay. The first thing, the AI economy.
Very bullish.
Fair.
Yeah.
Do you want to expand on
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. I thought this was like quick, short fire thing. Oh, I think it's probably the most transformative technology that we've seen for decades. And I would, a lot of folks think about Gen AI as being the focal point for that. But I think AI and machine learning has tremendous opportunity and applicability. Our company alone, we felt that there was at least a $3 billion earnings opportunity. That's almost 25% of our company earnings. And it really will change the way we do business. The key for companies like Manulife is to get ahead of the curve and to be the leader, because everyone will ultimately leverage AI, Gen AI, machine learning. But I think the real winners and losers will be defined by those who get ahead of the curve early and establish themselves and therefore build a competitive advantage. So I think there's going to be a mad race. There's a lot of hype and excitement. Maybe some of that's overblown, but I think in the long run, it's a significant tailwind for all industries, certainly financial services. And I think it'll transform the way work is done. But it's going to require leadership within organizations to rethink everything that gets done in the company and start with a blank piece of paper as opposed to looking for a 5% efficiency. So very, very bullish. I think it's the most transformative technology that we've seen for maybe 40 years.
I am equally bullish on the AI economy, despite all the worries about what it means for changing jobs and all that kind of stuff. Okay, bullish or bearish, Roy, on the subject of longevity. People are living longer lives, hopefully healthier lives. Bullish or bearish?
Bullish as well. And as an insurance company, we have a vested interest in longevity, which is where it's a perfect alignment of interest with the customer. If a customer lives longer, the customer wins, but so does the insurance company. So what we did 10 years ago, we invested in behavioral insurance, which is this idea of, well, we won't just hope that you live a healthier, longer life, but we're going to actually work with you to achieve that outcome. And that includes us giving you incentives to do things that actually lead to longevity. For example, taking steps, sleeping better, eating better, exercising. And if you did those things, then we would provide you with a discount on your premium because we would win, and therefore we wanted to encourage our customers to do that. So that's something that we've been working on for the last 10 years. Now, people are living longer. In the 1960s, the average age was about, life table meant that the average age of person's life would be to about 70. Now it's up to about 82 years of age. However, people aren't necessarily living healthier. So 12% of people's lives is lived in poor health. So I think the solution to the longevity equation is not just how do we help people live longer, but how do we actually ensure that they're living healthier in that time period?
Our third, bullish or bearish, Vegemite.
Vegemite is fantastic. I know everyone else outside of Australia absolutely hates it, but it's still a staple in our family household, and we've sort of tortured our kids' friends when they come over with forcing them to try some Vegemite. We haven't had too many takers or too many pleased people, but we're big fans.
An innovative product that
Yes.
takes, the leftovers from beer and turns it into something healthy. We appreciate you playing bullish or bearish. And speaking of Australia, that's where we wanted to start the conversation, where your early years were spent. And we wanted to talk about your journey, which you are the son of migrants who came over from Italy after the war. Your dad was a coal miner, so you had a very humble start to your life. Talk to us about the early years for Roy Gori.
Yeah, so we did start with humble beginnings, but we didn't want for too much. Mum and dad worked really hard, and they gave us what we needed. But it did instill a philosophy in all of us kids, which was that, you needed to work hard and nothing was going to be handed to you ever. Dad always said to me that you won't necessarily be the smartest person in the room or the wealthiest, but you can choose to be the hardest working. And that's a choice that you get to make. And that really rung true for me. And it's been, one of the cultural philosophies that I've run my life by. So I've always had lots of jobs as a kid. I was delivering papers at the age of 8. I delivered pharmaceuticals. When I was about 10, I've worked in fruit shops, aquarium, grocery store. So I was always working, and that meant that I had money, which would allow me to do things. So, a culture and a philosophy around working was a big part of the way I was brought up, and a big part of the philosophy that ultimately helped, craft who I've become.
Yeah, one of the things on this podcast that we kind of want to dive deeper into is what money means to you. So, when you talked about the job that you did when you were 10, I was reading about that job where you worked for the pharmacist delivering the medicine. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you said like at first you were like, "Oh, I'm making tips." And like you were like, "Let's get in, let's get the money, let's get out." And so, like for me as a kid, I think kids think of money as like a means to a material item. Like my parents had a condo and I painted it and I got a She-Ra doll. But then you saw something a little bit deeper. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Firstly, because we weren't handed money, we had to work for money. When I wanted to buy something, it was never that it costed $50, for example, pair of shoes. That's 8 hours of work. So there was always for me a value equation when I wanted to buy something, and it was always translated into how many hours do I need to work, and is it worth it, as opposed to is that any something that I want to buy, and do I want it, and are my friends having those things. But then as you rightly point out, when I started working, I learned that there were different ways to do a job. And in the pharmacy role where I was delivering pharmaceuticals to elderly who were people that couldn't leave their homes typically, I learned that I would get paid $4.50 an hour to deliver these medications. But I also encountered very lonely people who wanted to have a chat. And at first, this was a distraction and something that actually stopped me from doing more deliveries, to be perfectly honest. But I realized that if I spent a little bit of time with folks, then they would give me tips. In fact, often much more than I was actually getting paid. And that was an interesting insight. It taught me that it's not just about doing the job. It's about actually the effort that you put into it and what you can actually get from it. And these were incredibly interesting and fascinating individuals that I learned a lot from. There was one customer that I delivered pharmaceuticals for, and she was an Olympian. And she would tell me the stories of her youth where she was training to compete in the national team for swimming. So it really gave me some really great insights into being present, being with people, and actually that's something that will be rewarded if you sort of do it the right way.
Like if you're paying attention and actually being present, that people want to reward you and pay more.
Right, exactly. And again, you can do a job and say, I'm just going to do it and I'll get X for it. Or if I put a little bit more effort and I'm more present and I'm actually engaging in it and enjoying it, there's another equation for value that comes from that. Sometimes it's tips, but in other cases, it's actually a learning experience. You'll gain learning from that job or from that assignment, and therefore there's value there as well.
Right. It was actually you were gaining too, because you realized in the moment, wow, these people all have these incredible stories. So there's a symbiotic relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Staying on that subject of personal connection, you're a relatively young guy, but you've been in the financial services industry for basically 4 decades, because coming right out of high school, you're 17, you get your first big industry job, you work for Citibank, but you've told a story in I think your early time there. The head of that organization in Australia was in the elevator, and you quickly learned a few lessons in leadership in terms of knowing the people that are working with you. What was that story?
Yeah, and for me, that story I often use to just describe how important it is for the younger generation to actually be in the office and be present, because there's so much learning and development you can actually get from being around people and not necessarily just about completing your job. But in this example, I was 2 weeks in at Citi. I was 17 years of age and I was in the elevator. There were about 3 or 4 other people in the elevator with me, and the doors open and in comes the CEO of the Australia business, Citibank Australia. And as he walks in, I was feeling kind of intimidated, but he points to the first person. He says, "Jane, how you doing? How's that project that you're working on? You're near completion yet?" And he had a bit of a banter with her. And then he moved to the next person and said, "John, I heard your wife's not well. I hope, how's she doing? Is she doing better? Hopefully she's okay. Let me know if I can help you in any way." Then he moved to the next person and they were undertaking some audit of some type. And then he turns to me, and again, I was sweating at this point, but he said, "You're new." And I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "What's your name?" I said, Roy Gori." He said, "Where do you work?" And asked me a few questions. And he said, "Good." He said, "I'm hoping to hear great things about you." And then he left. And I was incredibly motivated and inspired. But more importantly, I saw a leader who really connected and cared about people. And I thought, that's the kind of leader I want to be. I want to be the leader that knows people, can connect with them, because every one of those individuals felt like they were important. And I'm sure as a result of that feeling, we're going to work 50% harder than they would normally. And therefore, the business is going to do better. And maybe it's a little bit more enjoyable as a job as well. But that was an early lesson for me in leadership. And it's not something you learn in a textbook or a classroom, but it's about personal connection and how critical that is to running an organization. It's a critical component of a culture that you create, but it's also important for really driving performance and motivating people to be their best and do their best.
So what about all this post-COVID hybrid workspace stuff? Do you
Yeah.
think that we should all be in person?
So I think the folks that are suffering the most through the work from home environment are the younger generation, where there is so much to learn. When you're in your first decade of your career, it's not just about getting a job done, getting promoted, getting more pay. It's about what you're learning from others, just observing folks, how they interact with each other. It's the network that you benefit from, the mentorship, and so on. So I really do feel that's an important part of development for individuals, but I think it's also an important part of the culture that an organization creates. And it's about those unsaid truths that dictate how a company operates, which you could lose if you're just in a remote-only environment. Now, the reality is we're in a hybrid environment. I think that's here to stay to some extent, but I'm certainly someone that's in favor of more time in the office than less. And we moved very early with a 3-day in mandate. That was ahead of most other financial services companies in Canada. And, I think that will become a competitive advantage. I think folks that are just in a remote-only environment will struggle eventually through maybe some of the cultural challenges that come from that and the development issues that may emerge. Where do we land? I don't know. But I think 3 to 4 days in the office is probably what's required to ensure you don't compromise the culture.
Something else I think, especially for younger people in the workforce, is that there are fewer, call it full-time jobs. Sort of the hustle economy is very much a part of the culture today. Maybe less so when you were starting out, but we said that you got into the professional world right out of high school. What we didn't mention was at night you were getting your undergrad degree, eventually getting your MBA. So working hard. And you talked earlier about some of the early lessons you had with money. How were you thinking about money once you were into the corporate world and you could see the growth you were having and you were working on the education component? What was going through your mind at that time?
I feel like an old timer. In my day, I had to walk 25 kilometers to get to school and stuff like that. But no, I did work full time and did my degree part time. That was tough, but it was very valuable in many ways because my learnings that I gained from the degree, I was instantly applying to the work environment. I was instantly thinking, how does this apply? And in some cases it didn't apply, but in other cases it did. But specifically to your question around my relationship with money, I would say that I never really took a job for money. I always felt that the most valuable thing that I can do in the early part of my career was gain experience. And the experience is like building your CV. It's an asset that ultimately will convert into money. So money is the later outcome or something that will eventually follow. And I do see some folks get a little bit too caught up in how much am I getting paid? Am I getting promoted? And how much is that job going to pay? And they use that to dictate which jobs they should take and which ones they shouldn't, which is kind of funny because when you go and do an MBA, you can pay $250,000 for it, and it's an asset. And I think the early years of your experience you should also consider an asset. So I've always said, I'm going to take jobs that give me experience and exposure and help build my capability as a leader. And then the money will come. And that sort of has worked out.
So, to that end of it being an asset and taking all those experiences and it converting to money, you started your paper route at the age of 8. Would you say, like to our kids, your kids, to youth, start as young as you can to build that CV and get those experiences?
100%. I think having a relationship with money, which is that it's not just free, is an important part of character building. So I think for the younger generation, them understanding how hard it is to earn $10 is really critical. And to have that equation of those pair of shoes are X hours of work, I think that's a healthy thing. Otherwise, I don't think you necessarily have a good appreciation for the value of things. But then again, I do think experiences will come. And again, it sounds like, well, what could you learn from a paper route or from a pharmacy run? And the reality is you learn a lot of social skills from those. You learn how to interact with other people. You learn that, as I sort of described earlier, there's two ways to do the job. I can do the job and get paid the bare minimum wage, or I can put a little bit more effort into it. And there's other benefits that will accrue, be it learning or, in the case of the pharmacy job, tips that, quite frankly, I didn't think were possible.
Yeah.
Well, paper routes seem to be a common thread with successful people. Roy Gori, Tim Cook at Apple, Warren Buffett, all did it.
I did a paper route.
All right.
There you go, Caroline Leslie. And it's funny. I think about Apple or Berkshire Hathaway. Culture is something we talk about with successful businesses. You have talked a lot about culture. You've tried to make it a focal point of your leadership. And one of the things we wanted to ask you about, because in the stock market, it's really hard to quantify culture, but you will hear, especially among successful investors, that they are looking for companies that have the right leadership, the right directional pull, and through their culture can have success. So there's a strong argument to be made that culture helps somebody's investment portfolio, but how do you go about building culture? What was that experience like for you?
Well, firstly, I think you're 100% correct. And I think any CEO or any leader, quite frankly, has or should have culture as their number one priority. And I think for any organization, true long-term sustainable success can only come from a differentiated culture. So I think you need to start with that premise. It's hard to quantify how that translates into shareholder value or to put a precise equation on X equals Y, but it's an absolute truth that culture will drive long-term sustainable success and is the most critical and most important priority of any leader, CEO or otherwise. So, I've embraced that philosophy personally, and I've embraced that with my leadership team. And I think that culture has to start from the top. You can't talk a good game on culture and then not demonstrate the behaviors as a leader that are consistent or that drive the culture that you want. If you're not displaying those behaviors yourself. And you have to hold yourself accountable to that. And I think it's important for you to create an equation where you hold your team accountable, but where they can hold you personally accountable as well. I've said many times to my organization that as the CEO or as a leader, you become the metronome for the organization. If you bring energy, passion, excitement, focus, that's the pace that the organization typically runs at. So, I passionately believe in that. I think you need to make that a priority for the organization. I don't think it's easy. You can't change a culture overnight. I think it starts with you having a bold ambition around it. I think it starts with an accountability of your own behaviors. But then I think you have to also drive accountability throughout the organization, and you have to make the tough calls. Like at Manulife, we started very early in my tenure to measure performance reviews by what someone did as well as how they did it. So you'd get a rating out of 5 on what you did. So if you delivered fantastic results, you would get a 1, the highest rating. But we also married that with a how rating. So if you demonstrated fantastic, cultural attributes and values, you'd also get a 1. But if you were terrible from a culture perspective, you might get a 4 or a 5. That we took the next step, and by the way, the performance rating actually determines your compensation as well. We made the next step of actually saying, well, the lower of the two will be your rating for the year. So if you're a 1-3, your overall rating was going to be a 3, and that was where you were given guidance on how much the compensation increases were going to be for the year, or the bonuses and so on and so forth. So we said very early, we're serious about this, and it's going to affect compensation. And, the reality is, in the past, we had deal makers who were absolute stars, but got away with terrible behavior. And we had to lose some people. And it's, you're going to be held accountable through what you do as a leader, and keeping people who are phenomenal deliverers of performance, but are terrible on the culture front, is a surefire way to really destroy your own culture as well.
I love that you made that paramount. And it also, just going back to the earlier story in the elevator, how he saw everybody. It doesn't matter what level you're at. You see each other in that way.
Yeah,
It's really,
absolutely.
really awesome that you did that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that a lot of people talk about with you is the fact that you decided that you would step down as CEO. You had a great run. You led a period of sizable transformation with the company. We mentioned that for people who invested in the business over that period of time, there was outperformance versus the stock market. But you worked so hard, upwards of 4 decades, to get to the point where you could be calling the shots on culture and everything else. And I think a lot of people said, why would he decide to step down at this point? And especially in a culture that is driven by money, where being the CEO pays pretty well if you keep doing it, Roy. So what was your thinking there?
So the first thing I'd say is it was a real privilege, and it was quite humbling to be asked to lead Manulife, this incredible Canadian success story, most global financial services company in Canada, with this incredible presence, not just in Canada, but in the US and in Asia, operating in Asia since 1897. So fantastic business and history. So that was, a very humbling experience for me. And it was something that I felt very privileged about. And I never, ever took that for granted. But when I took that role on in 2017, and in a similar way to every other role that I've taken on, I put a date in the diary when I was going to finish that job. And I gave myself 7 years for that job. And it's not necessarily a hard and fast, I'm not going to spend 1 day more than that or less. But I use that to ensure that I bring urgency to my job, and that I don't think that I've got infinite time and that there's always more time to do what I needed to get done. And the way that translates for me is, if I've got 7 years in the job, every day that goes by is one less day to achieve what I wanted to achieve. So it's almost like this hourglass that's flipped. And it's almost like, oh, that's 1 day less. I've got to get on with it. So it's really been very motivating for me to ensure that I don't just sit back and relax, that I'm always on and I'm pushing as hard as I possibly can to do what I need to do. If you think that you've got an end period, and you want to achieve what is hopefully a significant transformation, you've got a finite time. It brings urgency. Now, that can put a lot of stress into the organization as well, but it meant that there was always a lot of energy, pace, and urgency. Now, for me, it ended up being a little bit more than that. It was almost 8 years. And I sort of give myself a pass for COVID that maybe it took a little bit longer. But I also set at that time a pretty bold agenda on what I wanted to have achieved. And ultimately, I started with this view of, well, what does retiring look like? Or what does moving on from this job look like? What would I like to say when I've moved on? And part of that's, yes, I want to see the share price perform in a certain way so that our shareholders are rewarded well. I want to change the culture of the company and make sure that we've got awesome people and great leadership that can continue the success story. But we also wanted to transform our organization from being a very manual, paper-based organization to being a much more digital one. So that's sort of the philosophy that I used. And, a year before I retired, I felt that I'd done what I set out to achieve. And I sat with the board and I said, I think it's time. I think you've got great successes to choose from in terms of continuing the legacy that we've started. But it's healthy for organizations to have new leadership and fresh eyes. I think a lot of CEOs often stay on maybe longer than they should, and maybe for the wrong reasons. Maybe money, maybe pride. But for me, those weren't factors, and I felt really good about what I've achieved. And I think, again, you want to not run the risk that your legacy becomes tainted as well for whatever reason. So I felt leaving in a great way, feeling proud of the legacy you've left. But for me, it was also about the excitement about the next chapter. There's a lot of exciting things that I'm keen to do, and it's about embracing those new avenues of opportunity.
Well, job well done. And on that note, what is next? What does retirement look like?
So there's a lot on it. And to be honest, I was hoping I'd be a little bit less busy this many weeks into retirement. That's not the case, but I think I'm my own worst enemy, saying yes to a whole lot of things that maybe I should not. But again, the reality of these jobs is that they are very demanding. And I've loved every minute. So that's not a complaint. I've loved every minute. It's a privilege and an honor. And I get a lot of value. I got a lot of value from leading the company. But they take up 70% of your life. You don't go on vacation and not work. Weekends are working and so on. And again, that's not a sacrifice because you love what you do. But it means that you've got 30% of your time for all the other things that you love as well. And this next chapter is about saying, well, I want those other things to represent 70% of my time and maybe 30% on work-related items. So that's sort of the movement or the way I'm thinking about moving into this next phase. In terms of things that we're focused on, philanthropy is one. We're very lucky through the jobs that we've had to be doing well, and therefore we want to help people that are less fortunate than we are, and we think that's a responsibility. So we're certainly focused on philanthropy as one of the buckets of effort. We like to travel as a family, so traveling is certainly something that's also a focus for us. I want to learn new things. So it's also about growth and expansion. I'm learning a musical instrument at the moment. I'm learning Italian. I'm doing Pilates. So I'm doing things that are, about growth and learning and development. And then finally, I want to invest. We talked about longevity. I'm very passionate about longevity and well-being. And I think too much of the healthcare system, not just in Canada, but globally, is focused on treatment as opposed to prevention. There is a ton of amazing entrepreneurs who are doing some phenomenal things in the prevention space. And I'm keen to invest in those companies. I'm keen to mentor those CEOs and founders and help them because I think there's a greater good. And I think there's also an economic opportunity as well to be had because right now in Canada, for example, there's about $400 billion a year that's spent on healthcare. 95% of that is in treatment, 5% is on prevention. And every dollar of prevention is equal to $3 of treatment. And I think there's a phenomenal opportunity to do much more for the well-being of Canadians and at the same time shift the balance a little bit more.
And how would you go about investing in an area that you're passionate about? Because that sometimes is hard for people. There's stocks, there's ETFs, that kind of stuff. But if there's a trend you're watching, which is exciting, like how do you go about investing in it?
Yeah. So a lot of these companies are very early stage startups. So they're the venture capital world. And it's about having, a network and an ecosystem around those companies. And thankfully through, I guess my job and the experience that I've gained, I've got a good, I guess, toe into that world and to the various companies that are investing in that space, also some of the entrepreneurs that are in that space as well. So getting a bit of a viewpoint on who those companies are is relatively easy. The problem is there are thousands of them. So deciphering which are the ones that you want to invest your time in is where I think more effort needs to be placed, and that's harder.
Is there many preventative companies in Canada? Because I've seen many in the US where they do the full body scan, like the Prunovo and stuff like that, but I haven't seen as many in Canada.
They are coming. So there are more and more that are sort of starting to develop in this space. There's one company that I was talking to recently that are looking at putting a stint in your body that allows you to measure or filter blood 24/7 real time and see if there are any cancer properties in your body. So Grail's a great example of a preventative health treatment where you take a blood draw and you see whether there's any markers of cancer, for example. Now, there's this company that's actually looking at putting a stent in your body that will actually measure your blood, or at least filter your blood and actually see if there's any signs 24/7. So it's not just once a year when you're actually identifying that. So short answer to your question is there's some incredible entrepreneurs and innovators in Canada. And I don't think we harness or support the innovators here in Canada as well as we need to. A lot of focus and attention's on the US, but I think we've got some phenomenal and amazing entrepreneurs who are doing some tremendous things that we should be supporting.
You're challenging yourself in this next part of your journey to back innovative new companies. What's the instrument, by the way,
Oh,
that you're challenging yourself with right now to learn? The instrument you're trying to learn?
the musical instrument
Yeah.
is the guitar.
The guitar,
So I'm
okay.
learning its guitar.
Okay, so you're working on guitar. You're looking for new investment opportunities. You're a dedicated athlete. You do triathlons. So this idea of challenging yourself seems deep in your bones, and I am curious where that comes from. Because that does require someone to get up with drive and purpose every day. So what is it that fuels you to challenge yourself?
I think that growth comes when you're out of your comfort zone. And we talked earlier about the fact that you guys have traveled around quite a bit. And that is not easy. Unfortunately, 90% of the population will say that's just too hard and will stick to within their comfort zone. I think that's generally true for most people about most things. And a philosophy that I've had early on was that you're only going to grow, develop when you push yourself out of your comfort zone into the place that's uncomfortable and awkward. When you're in the deep end of the pool, you'll learn to swim. Now, there's risk associated with being in the deep end of the pool. But if you've got confidence and conviction, I think that's where you get growth. So I've always tried to push myself and to see whether I can, do things that I might have thought were impossible or very difficult. And I think through that experience, you get failure and you've got to be comfortable with that. And in many ways, you've got to try to think through what is the worst thing that could possibly happen and can you deal with that to mitigate that so that it's not disastrous. But I think life is about growth and development. I think that's true personally, and I think it's true professionally. So, I've always wanted to push the envelope and to do things that I wasn't sure whether I could do it. Doing a full Ironman triathlon, I wasn't sure that that's something I could actually do. And once you start training for it and you commit, then you put the effort in and make sure that you can complete it. We've traveled around, lived in different countries, and that again was a real big challenge. It was a difficulty, but it comes with growth and great learning and opportunity as well.
Yeah, it's the scary things that you push through and growth is on the other side. But I like how you said what's the worst thing that could happen, playing that scenario out in your head. I think I've always just dove in and not thought about the worst thing, but I really like that. So it can help people that maybe might be afraid to push through.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we get to the end of the podcast, Caroline, I know there's one question that you're always curious to ask our guests when it comes to the subject of money.
Oh, yeah. Well, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but I guess given all of the, you started at 8 years old with your paper route and then how far you've come, what would you say to, I would usually say your 10-year-old self, but since you started at 8, what would you say to what would you say to your 8-year-old self about money today?
I think it would be, again, just about working hard. I would say the key to success in life is about just working hard. But again, I think that message that I received from my dad early on was that, things that you can't control are about, the natural abilities that you might have or how much wealth you have. But there are things that you can control, and lean into those and don't be a victim. Embrace the opportunities. And for me, it was about, just work as hard as you can and, gain as much experience as you can early on. I think that has been something that certainly has helped me in my career. And it's something that has translated into opportunity, because whenever you're in a position where you're working hard and you're getting these opportunities, if you do it better than maybe it's ever been done, people will notice that and will give you other opportunities. Doors are always opening for those people that are A, hardworking, but B, willing to do the best that they can.
Well, it's been an incredible journey, Roy, and still so many opportunities out there, including bringing Vegemite to more people around the world. Still big opportunity.
It's a mission that I have to embrace and tackle.
Roy Gori, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Great to be here with you both.
All right. Our thanks to Roy Gori.
And please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next edition of Ticker Take.
See you next time.